Within the Penn State Department of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science, we are also honored to have the Pennsylvania State Climate Office. And here, every so often, we invite the state climatologist in to chat with us on Weather World. I'm pleased to welcome back to the show tonight, Kyle Imhoff. Thanks so much for being here, Kyle.
It's good to be here, Rob. Thanks for having me.
So we always like to check in on some initiatives that you have that you're working on as part of the Climate Office. And one of those is actually the Keystone Mesonet. Talk about some of the progress with installing some new PEMN sites.
Yeah, so we haven't had any installs over the cold season since we last spoke, but there's been several new developments that are exciting and I'm happy to share today. So we have some additional funding. We have 30 new sites that are going to be installed across the state, and that is from PEMA actually has received funding to revamp their iFlows network. So that network was designed to monitor rainfall data and stream levels. They were primarily worried about flooding risk across the state, but now we're going to get additional funding to have up to 50 sites now that'll be part of our PEMN network, and that'll be included in our Keystone Mesonet project. In addition to that, we also, as part of this project, we're partnering with school districts as sites for these units that we're going to install. And because of that, we actually have a school district in Franklin County, two of their educators, their names are Amy Kreider and Emily Trace. They're actually going to be developing K-12 curriculum using the weather data from our network. So that's going to be a really exciting partnership, and we're happy to partner with them to do lesson planning and utilize this data for students across the state.
That's great, because I think for a lot of us, we can say that the bug bites us early when it comes to meteorology. So it's great to have that in schools, and it's really a good resource because you're filling in a lot of those data holes. We use some of the cameras actually here on Weather World to show Cherry Springs State Park and Mount Davis and others. Talk about some of the other initiatives going on right now in the Climate Office.
So one thing I'm actually working on right now is part of our professional organization, the American Association of State Climatologists. I've been asked to be on a committee to determine criteria and guidelines to assess whether a mesonet, a weather network that has a lot of stations that are densely populated together, whether that is what we consider a gold standard network or up to a certain level of thresholds that we consider to be a high quality weather network. So I'm working on a committee right now to develop those guidelines, and eventually we'll get to the point where we'll certify these networks to say this is a network you can trust, it's reliable data, and gives us kind of a stamp of approval to say that you're doing what you need to do to make sure this network is at a good spot.
You know, during the semester, it's worth noting that you're not just a climatologist, you're also a meteorologist. And so you'll teach forecasting classes. And this semester in particular, you're teaching a class all about turf grass. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. So it's kind of an 8-week crash course in Introduction to Meteorology. So this program that I'm teaching is for golf course managers across the state. So we actually have a lot of our turf grass students go on to manage these golf courses across the country, and even internationally. We have some international students in that program as well. So we focus on things that are important to develop skills that are going to be relevant to their work. So we look at things like the basics of weather forecasting, understanding how to look at a weather map, identifying weather patterns, and not only does that help them assess how the weather impacts turf grass growth and the growth stages of turf grass, but also it helps them with their day-to-day course operations. So what's the kind of disruptive weather that may impact course operations? Do they need to suspend play? Those sort of things. So we try to give them the skills that are relevant to them when they go out and eventually become managers at these golf course locations.
You also work with other students in the Climate Office to come up with some articles for the Pennsylvania Observer. It's a really great newsletter that the Pennsylvania State Climate Office comes out with every month. I recommend you sign up for that as well. We'll put the link here on the screen. But talk about what it's like working with some of the students to come up with some of that content.
That's really fun, actually. And they come up with some ideas to write articles about topics that they're interested in. So we have a lot of diverse kinds of articles that we put in there. It also gives them experience looking at different data sets and coming up with different writing styles that can be relevant to them as they go out into the workforce. And we've had a lot of really interesting articles recently, both agriculture related, forecasting related, so that's a really important piece of the puzzle. And actually related to that, I have our climate studies course students working on right now a project to come up with monthly summary reports where we'll basically give a snapshot of what it's like across the state, temperature and precipitation anomalies, both statewide, climate divisional level, county level, and that'll be a part of our website actually. So they're going to be working on developing those tools and resources that can give people a pretty quick glance at what things were like recently across the state.
One of the great articles in this month's edition of the newsletter was about weather and its impacts on mosquito-borne illnesses. Can you talk a little bit about how weather impacts some of those illnesses and maybe give some light on maybe how that could impact the tick population too?
Right, yeah, so that's really interesting, the connections between weather patterns and populations of things like mosquitoes and ticks that we're all familiar with here in Pennsylvania. And it's been warm and relatively wet, not overly dry, for much of the mid to late winter and heading into early spring now. So it'll be interesting to see how that does impact the populations of things like mosquitoes and ticks, and then of course the illnesses that they bring with them. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over the spring and summer months. And current climate model guidance at least indicates that we probably won't see really cool and dry weather in the near term, so that will likely lead to these active periods for ticks and mosquitoes. So there likely will be some problems with both higher populations and disease risk across the state.
We're almost out of time, Kyle, but I wanted to ask, as people are kind of gearing up for growing and planting season, spring fever in the air with some of the weather like we've had recently, what are some tips for those when it comes to the last freeze and frost dates here in Pennsylvania?
Right, so when you look at regionally across the state, both the southeastern and central parts of the state, we receive our last freezes around early to mid-April, and then of course when you get into the higher elevations in northwestern Pennsylvania, it happens a couple weeks later than that. So mid to late April was the time period there. So the start of the growing season is coming up fast. So the next couple of weeks, we'll be monitoring when those last freezes occur.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kyle Imhoff, Pennsylvania State climatologist. Always a pleasure to have you stop by Weather World, and we'll be back in just a moment with more.